All right, Crim 5, let's knock out Chapter 7, Coping with the Human Experience of Being a Cop. And as you can imagine, being a police officer is it's not easy. It is not always a pleasant experience. Again, as you can imagine, there are pros and cons to being a police officer. I mean, some of the pros, it's always exciting. I mean, every day brings you a new experience. Very few times are you going to be bored as a police officer. Now, let me kind of clarify that with, there will be days when you're sitting around doing nothing and you're wondering, how long can I sit in this car and do nothing? How many hours can I, depending on, again, what agency you work for. I doubt that the Fresno Police Department officers are ever truly bored because Fresno is a really busy, big town with, unfortunately, a lot of crime. And so I don't think they're spending a lot of time sitting around, playing video games on their phone. However, you work for a smaller agency in the middle of the night, they're probably fairly bored. Can it become mundane dealing with the same type of issues over and over? Yeah. But at the same time, you're not going into an office Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, being bored out of your mind. So there are some pros. You get to change people, help people. There are also a lot of negatives. So be prepared. There are some negatives to this chapter. So anyways, let's talk about it. The real or perceived role of the police is changes in society. Early on in society, it was considered quite an honor, and in some areas in the community, in some cultures, in some neighborhoods, it's an honor to be a police officer. In other neighborhoods, people hate cops, so it kind of depends on where you live and what your perception is toward police officers as to whether being a police officer is a good thing or a bad thing. Being a police officer can be exciting, challenging, and rewarding, and it can also be devastating for those who are not prepared. And by not prepared, I'm talking about, people who maybe go into this career very gung-ho and maybe are not fully aware of some of the downsides of being a police officer. And by that, I mean things like, the all-encompassing mental toll that being a police officer can really have on a human being and on your family. And I lived through this as the daughter of a police officer. And I'll be honest, I don't think my dad was ever really prepared to be a police officer in the context that I don't know how much that he knew how much it would impact him or his family. It was not good for him. He was not the kind of guy that could bounce back. He was not, he couldn't easily leave his job at home. He mentally, I don't know that he was mentally the strongest person. And I think being a police officer really aided him. And the things that he saw on a daily basis really broke him down, and he didn't have a really good defense mechanism, and he turned to negative things to deal with it. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody does that. I know a lot of police officers who, going into the career, going into the field, knew this, knowing that this can really tear you down as a person, and being prepared for that and having a strong background, a strong idea of who you are before you go in is definitely a benefit and can keep you from falling into the negativity. But there are so many stressors. The stressor of everyday thinking and knowing, not thinking, but knowing that people would love to hurt you. It's a fact. Anyone who has a badge on is a target. You're constantly dealing with stressful situations. The second you see a police officer, you're driving down the street, do you act differently when you see a police officer? Some of you are going to say yes. A lot of you are going to say, well, a lot of you will say yes. Some of you will say no. Community isolation. You're out with a bunch of friends, and one of them says, oh, here's my friend so-and-so. Oh, he's a cop. This is out in a social setting. Are you going to behave differently? Are you going to look at that person differently? Many times, even in a social setting, when he's not wearing his uniform, he or she is not wearing their uniform and whatever, you're going to look at them differently. They're going to be treated differently. So the police stigma follows them everywhere. Historically, policing has not been as dangerous as perceived by the public. And this is really sadly true. More police officers are killed in accidents, like vehicle accidents, motor vehicle accidents, than they are in the line of duty as far as, gunshot wounds, stabbings, things like that. Although, of course, within the last, 10 years or so, there has been a lot of anger and additional hate aimed at police. There have been strained relationships toward police, and there have been some deliberate acts of violence toward police. I want to say it was probably 2016, 17, when there were some deliberate acts of violence on police officers. I believe it was in Dallas. A lot of people think that police officers' jobs are super exciting. And yeah, like I said earlier, sometimes that's true. And sometimes it couldn't be a lot more boring than they could. Sometimes their jobs are super boring. Let's say that. Trying to pass the time. I remember working in Madera at the police department. I was a dispatcher there in probably 1995, 6, something like that. And I worked I was working the graveyard shift, and literally we would have 0 calls from, sometimes from like 2 o'clock in the morning until maybe 7 in the morning. I was the dispatcher, and I was doing everything I possibly could do to not fall asleep in the dispatch booth. So I can only imagine what the officers were doing out in the field. We'd have 2 or 3 officers on, maybe 3. So they were probably just as bored as I was. Also, then imagine what this does to your body. You go from 0, absolutely nothing happening, to a shots fired call. And your body goes from 0 to 100 real quick. Okay, sorry, I had to quote Drake there. But anyways, imagine what that does to your body. Anyways, so yeah, police work can be very boring and very exciting. Police officers do spend some time fighting crime, but probably the majority of their time they spend on service calls for service, like, sorry, there goes my phone ringing. We're just going to have to ignore it because nobody calls my phone. It's somebody calling me from Oklahoma. Interesting. I'm sure it is somebody trying to sell me solar, so we'll just ignore that. Calls for service, dogs barking, noise complaints, things like that. So probably the vast majority of their time they spend on calls for service that really don't include fighting crime. Use of force. Another thing that a lot of people think, wow, police officers are spending a lot of their time using force against others. Police officers also spend a significant portion of their training time learning how to use force. Although the amount of time they use on the job actually using force is very, very small. And again, even working as a probation officer, I spent a significant portion of my training hours was on use of force, whether that be firearms training, weaponless defense, baton training, hand-to-hand combat type training. All this, we spent hours doing that kind of training. And I can say, gosh, I spent very little time in my job actually using force. Now, being a campus police officer on a high school campus, clearly we had fights, a lot of fights on campus, so I did use it somewhat, but there's so much emphasis put on this whole concept of force, but we really didn't use it that often. It's the same kind of deal with police officers. So it was also key and very important to be professional in your use of force. So what policing does to the police. Working personalities. It's very interesting to see police officers in their normal day-to-day personalities as opposed to when they are dealing with the public, because they're typically different. And again, I'm going to use myself as an example. Of course, I was not a police officer, but as a probation officer, I was a different person when I was wearing all of my gear, my bulletproof vest, my gun, my duty belt, my badge, all that kind of stuff. Pretty much everything about my personality was different because of it was my working personality. I was professional at all times. Because danger was always there, my guard was always up, always knew where other officers were, and it was just a different lifestyle. And then when you're in your day-to-day life, it was very different, and it's kind of almost hard to explain. When I would bump into somebody that I knew from my normal day-to-day life while I was in my work gear, it was like they almost didn't recognize me, which is kind of weird. The authority invested in police further isolates police officers from a public that resents their direction. People don't like being told what to do. I would bust into people's houses and tell them to sit down or to go somewhere else, get out of this room. Nobody likes when someone comes into their home and tells them what to do. So you can kind of imagine that people resent that behavior. Yeah. A lot of times people, selection of a police officer, people who are chosen to be police officers are typically people who are going to have authoritarian personalities and can make a decision. And this is one of those things that I specifically, if I was going to go out in the field with someone and go do an arrest or search warrants or things like that, the one thing that I did not want was to go in the field with someone who couldn't make a decision. You've all heard of the police subculture as well. Socialization is thought to occur due to rigid rules of the formal organization, the informal police subculture, and the inherent nature of policing. Does it make sense why police officers tend to bond with each other? Can you imagine why they do? The values and beliefs that the individual officer takes into work may or may not be compatible with those held by other officers. The new officer must reassess his or her personal perspective in order to determine whether or not his beliefs align with the other police norms. Again, as I mentioned before, a lot of times police officers are isolated, rejected, alienated from the public in general. People either love the police or they hate the police. I mean, again, consider your own experiences. You have a friend, someone maybe who's a police officer. Do all your friends accept that person? Do they want them to come hang out on Friday night? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Police as a minority group. People tend to exclude police from their circle of friends because of the nature of law enforcement occupation and its responsibilities. Neighbors and friends have difficulty separating that person from the badge. Police officers and their families develop strategies to cope with isolation from the community. As a kid, my parents, my dad we had parties at our house all the time. All cop parties. Every person who was at our house was a cop. It was really sad because they also alienated themselves. Then, again, the police officer then becomes isolated from the family. So imagine the horrible things that police officers see. Rapes, murders, children's bodies, strewn across the street, being smashed by cars, horrific violence, suicides, brains blown all over the bed, babies being put in microwaves. All these things I'm telling you are things that have happened and things that police officers see. Okay, then come home to see your beautiful family. What's going through your mind? Well, not everybody is strong enough to say, or to, not everybody has the tools, the mechanism to clearly separate the two. So a lot of times they start pulling away. They also do have the shift work. The shift work can make it very difficult, constantly changing shifts, the potential for danger, the constant worry, accommodations that must be made in the family life, trying to figure out who's going to watch the kids, who's going to pick up the kids, who's going to do this, who's going to do that. I remember many holidays where my dad was at work, and ultimately, as a child, we just learned to live our lives without my dad because he was just never there. And then ultimately he just left. So it is very disruptive on the family. The high divorce rate linked to police occupation. Blah, blah, blah. That lower rate might be, the rate has been lowering, but that might be because there are more women involved in policing. I don't think it mentions it in this chapter, but a lot of times, based on my observation, would be the police officers having affairs with other women. I shouldn't say typically the men, but seems to have been my experience. There's a lot of alcoholism in police work, but economic hazards of policing. Do you think police officers are rich? Yes. Before entering a career in law enforcement, potential candidates should carefully weigh the pros and cons. Financial considerations can't be ignored. Inadequate pay remains a problem for law enforcement officers nationwide. If you consider, I think Fresno Police Department, I think they actually pay pretty well here in Fresno, City of Fresno, Fresno PD. I would imagine if you had been here a few years, you could make upwards of $70,000, $80,000 a year. With overtime, you could probably get your way up to $100,000 as just a regular officer. However, you have to remember that if you work for the government, that when the budget, nationwide, when the budget as a whole isn't doing well, then law enforcement typically ends up getting on the chopping block pretty quickly. So when layoffs occur, police and fire seem to be the ones that take the butt, or the seem to get cut fairly quickly. There's also career limitations. You can only have one chief, a couple of lieutenants, a few captains, So you have to consider an agency like Fresno PD, there's a decent number of opportunities for promotion because it's a big agency. But if you're looking at a small agency like Madera, there's not a lot of room for advancement. So again, just other things to think about. There's liability issues. If you shoot someone and you get sued, very, 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 very possible that you could lose everything you own. So I think we talked about unions at some point in this class. This is the reason why, even though I'm kind of on the fence about unions in general, I would always recommend being a member of a union for that very reason, in case, somebody is trying to sue you. Liability is always it's always that cloud hanging over your head as a person in law enforcement or corrections, for that point. Health hazards, violence, you can always get hurt. Police officers get hurt, sometimes in chases, sometimes in fights, sometimes in car accidents. I mean, there's lots of different ways that officers get hurt on the job. Accidents, again, more officers lose their lives in accidents than they do as a result of homicides. So vehicle accidents happen all the time with law enforcement. And contagious diseases. Here's yet another thing you have to think about. My dad got really sick from some guy he arrested a long time ago back in Selma. Ended up hospitalized, very sick. But you have to touch people as a law enforcement official, as you can imagine. So you name it, they have it. So you have to basically assume that everyone you touch has a contagious disease, hepatitis, tuberculosis, HIV, COVID, you name it. You just basically have to assume that whoever you're touching has it. So that is definitely yet one of the other fabulous things about being a police officer. Sorry, guys, I told you this chapter was kind of depressing. Stress, emotional distress, all of these things. Yeah, I know. So it's vitally important that law enforcement administrators and their employees realize the source and consequences of stress. A lot of police officers, again, as you can imagine, are not first on the list to volunteer to go to counseling or seek help either, mental help, psychological help, because there's still that stigma that people think that makes them look weak, especially men. There are programs through the vast majority of law enforcement agencies, employee assistance programs. But when officers do not deal with the stress and handle it in a healthy way, it can turn out quite bad. Suicide is definitely something that is relatively common among police officers. Again, you can imagine the things that police officers see. I listed a few of those, mentioned a few of those things, and it just goes on and on from there. If you can imagine the most horrific crime scene the most horrific crime scene that you could come up with in your mind has probably existed. So, and a police officer has probably seen that. So, PTSD is real. And those employee assistance programs are there, but the officers have to be willing to accept the help. Alcohol, definite problem, and other drugs. Alcohol is typically the drug of choice among police officers. Caffeine, nicotine, the use of illicit drugs may also develop. Excuse me. Physical wellness, you'll note that Sometimes officers also, you've probably seen an officer or two that maybe let their health, being physical health, get a little out of control. So staying physically fit is also another issue that needs to be addressed, because their physical fitness is also something that will keep the officers. I'm sorry, I got distracted. You hear my dogs are barking. Okay, so a lot of police agencies will have either a gym or allow their officers to give them free gym membership so that they can stay physically well and coping with being a cop. Selection. Police reformers have called for the use of selection criteria to work out those persons who are unfit. This is very difficult because people change. Oops, sorry. Modern police officers must be, here's all the things they must be: intelligent, articulate, diplomatic, and compassionate. And they're asking for all this stuff with just a high school diploma. Right? So I have a strange feeling that throughout the next few years, we might be trying to see that level of education go up for police officers. I might be wrong, but these are all the things we're asking of them. You can see there's more bullet points here. Dedicated in serving their community, use discretion, be fair, unbiased, all this kind of stuff. Yet we're only asking for a high school diploma. Oops, I went backwards, sorry. And this is basically the hiring process: written exam, oral exam, physical agility test, medical exams, polygraph, situational testing, background, and psychological profiling. How can we, and we're already doing all this, and we're still getting bad apples. Training. They train for at least 40 hours a year, so 1 week per year, which is rough because we'd like to do more, but how can we afford to pull them off the streets for more than a week a year? I think that's what the tough part's been. So new police officers go through the FTO program, or Field Training Officer program. So they're typically with a field training officer for 6 months, a year, kind of depends. So they don't ride alone until they pass the FTO program. Some agencies have family programs that will help to ease the family into the whole police family as well. They have wellness programs, challenges of being a cop and doing community relations. And that's it. It was a long one, sorry.